Okay, this is chapter 9, part 6 of the Order of Things by Michel Foucault. Part 6 is called The Retreat and the Return of the Origin. The last feature that characterizes both man's mode of being and the reflection addressed to him is the relation to the origin, a relation very different from that which classical thought tried to establish in its ideal genesis. In the 18th century, to the return to the origin was to place oneself once more as near as possible to the mere duplication of representation. Economics was conceived on the basis of barter, because in barter, the two representations that each party made to himself of his property and the other's property were equivalent, since they were offering satisfaction for almost identical desires. They were, in some, alike. The order of nature was conceived prior to any catastrophe as a table in which beings followed one another in so tightly knit an order, and upon so continuous a fabric, that in going from one point of this succession to another, one would have moved within a quasi-identity, and in going from one extremity of it to the other one would have been led by the smooth expanse of likeness. The origin of language was conceived as the transparency between the representation of a thing and the representation of the cry, sound, or gesture, the language of action that accompanied it. Finally, the origin of knowledge was sought within this pure sequence of representations, a sequence so perfect and so linear that the second had replaced the first without one's becoming conscious of the fact, since they were not simultaneous, since it was not possible to establish any difference between them, and since one could not experience the second as other than like the first. And it was only when a sensation appeared to be more like a previous one than all the others that reminiscence could come into play. That imagination could represent a representation afresh, and that knowledge could gain a foothold in this duplication. It was of little importance whether this origin was considered fictitious or real, whether it possessed the value of an explanatory hypothesis or a historical event. In fact, these distinctions exist only for us. In a system of thought for which chronological development resides within a table, upon which it constitutes no more than a line of a certain length. Its starting point is at the same time outside real time and inside it. It is the first fold that enables all historical events to take place. In modern thought, such an origin is no longer conceivable. We have seen how labor, life, and language acquired their own historicity, in which they were embedded. They could never, therefore, truly express their origin, even though, from the inside, their whole history is, as it were, directed towards it. It is no longer origin that gives rise to historicity. It is historicity that, in its very fabric, makes possible the necessity of an origin, which must be both internal and foreign to it. Like the virtual tip of a cone in which all differences, all dispersions, all discontinuities would be knitted together so as to form no more than a single point of identity. The impalpable figure of the same, yet possessing the power, nevertheless, to burst open upon itself and become other. Man was constituted at the beginning of the 19th century in correlation with these historicities, with all these things involuted upon themselves and indicating through their display, but by means of their own laws, the inaccessible identity of their origin. Yet man's own relation to his origin does not occur in the same way. This is because man, in fact, can be revealed only when bound to a previously existing historicity. He is never contemporaneous with that origin which is outlined through the time of things, even as it eludes the gaze. When he tries to define himself as a living being, he can uncover his own beginning only against the background of a life which itself began long before him. When he attempts to reapprehend himself as a laboring being, he cannot bring even the most rudimentary forms of such a being to light, except within a human time and space, which have been previously institutionalized and previously subjected by society. And when he attempts to define his essence as a speaking subject, prior to any effectively constituted language, all he ever finds is the previously unfolded possibility of language, and not the stumbling sound, the first word upon the basis of which all languages, and even language itself, became possible. It is always against a background of the already begun that man is able to reflect on what may serve him as origin. For man, then, origin is by no means the beginning, a sort of dawn of history from which his ulterior acquisitions would have accumulated. Origin for man is much more the way in which man in general, any man, articulates himself upon the already begun of labor, life, and language. It must be sought for in that fold where man in all simplicity applies his labor to a world that has been worked for thousands of years, lives in the freshness of his unique, recent, and precarious existence, a life that has its roots in the first organic formations, and composes into sentences which have never before been spoken, even though generation after generation has repeated them. Words that are older than all memory. In this sense, the level of the original is probably that which is closest to man. The surface he traverses so innocently, always for the first time, and upon which his scarcely opened eyes discern figures as young as his own gaze. Figures that must necessarily be just as ageless as he himself, though for an opposite reason. It is not because they are always equally young. It is because they belong to a time that has neither the same standards of measurement nor the same foundations as him. But this thin surface of the original, which accompanies our entire existence and never deserts it, not even, indeed, especially not at the moment of death, when, on the contrary, it reveals itself as it were naked, is not the immediacy of a birth. It is populated entirely by those complex mediations formed and laid down as a sediment in their own history by labor, life, and language. So that in this simple contact, from the moment the first object is manipulated, the simplest need expressed, the most neutral word emitted. What man is reviving without knowing it is all the intermediaries of a time that governs him almost to infinity. Without knowing it, and yet it must be known in a certain way, since it is by this means that men enter into communication and find themselves in the already constructed network of comprehension. Nevertheless, this knowledge is limited, diagonal, partial, since it is surrounded on all sides by an immense region of shadow in which labor, life, and language conceal their truth and their own origin from those very beings who speak, who exist, and who are at work. The original, as modern thought has never ceased to describe it since the phenomenology of mind, is thus very different from that ideal genesis that the classical age had attempted to reconstitute. But it is also different, though linked to it by a fundamental correlation, from the origin that is outlined in a sort of retrospective beyond, through the historicity of beings, far from leading back or even merely pointing towards a peak, whether real or virtual or of identity, far from indicating the moment of the same at which the dispersion of the other has not yet come into play. The original in man is that which articulates him from the very outset upon something other than himself. It is that which introduces into his experience contents and forms older than him, which he cannot master. It is that which, by binding him to multiple, intersecting, often mutually irreducible chronologies, scatters him through time and pinions him at the center of the duration of things. Paradoxically, the original in man does not herald the time of his birth, or the most ancient kernel of his experience. It links him to that which does not have the same time as himself, and it sets free in him everything that is not contemporaneous with him. It indicates ceaselessly and in an ever-renewed proliferation that things began long before him, and that for this very reason, and since his experience is wholly constituted and limited by things, no one can ever assign him an origin. Now, this impossibility itself has two aspects. On the one hand, it signifies that the origin of things is always pushed further back, since it goes back to a calendar upon which man does not figure. But on the other hand, it signifies that man, as opposed to the things whose glittering birth time allows to show in all its density, is the being without origin, who has neither country nor date, whose birth is never accessible because it never took place. What is conveyed in the immediacy of the original is therefore that man is cut off from the origin that would make him contemporaneous with his own existence. Amid all the things that are born in time and no doubt die in time, he, cut off from all origin, is already there, so that it is in him that things, those same things that hang over him, find their beginning, rather than a cut made at some given moment in duration. He is the opening from which, in time in general, can be reconstituted. Duration can flow, and things at the appropriate moment can make their appearance. Though, in the empirical order, things are always set back from him, so that they are unapprehendable at their 0 point. Nevertheless, man finds himself fundamentally set back in relation to that setting back of things, and it is by this means that they are able to weigh down upon the immediacy of the original experience with their solid anteriority. A task is thereby set for thought, that of contesting the origin of things, but of contesting it in order to give it a foundation, by rediscovering the mode upon which the possibility of time is constituted. The origin with or without origin or beginning, on the basis of which everything is able to come into being. Such a task implies the calling into question of everything that pertains to time, everything that has formed within it, everything that resides within its mobile element, in such a way as to make visible that rent, devoid of chronology and history, from which time issued. Time would then be suspended within that thought, which nevertheless cannot escape from it, since it is never contemporaneous with the origin. But this suspension would have the power to revolve the reciprocal relation of origin and thought. And as it pivoted upon itself, the origin, becoming what thought has yet to think, and always afresh, would be forever promised in an imminence always nearer, yet never accomplished. In that case, The origin is that which is returning, the repetition towards which thought is moving, the return of that which has already always begun, the proximity of a light that has been shining since the beginning of time. But this time it is the recession into the future, the injunction that thought receives and imposes upon itself to advance with dove-like steps towards that which has never ceased to render it possible, to keep watch in front of itself on the ever-receding line of its horizon, for the day from which it came and from which it is coming in such profusion. At the very moment when it became possible for it to denounce as fantasies the ideal Genesis described in the 18th century, modern thought was establishing a problematics of the origin at once extremely complex and extremely tangled. This problematics has served as the foundation for our experience of time. And since the 19th century, as the starting point of all our attempts to re-apprehend what beginning and re-beginning, the recession and the presence of the beginning, the return and the end could be in the human sphere. In fact, modern thought established a relation to the origin that was inverse for man and for things. In this way, it sanctioned, but outwitted in advance and preserved all its power of contestation with regard to them. The positivist attempts to insert man's chronology within that of things in such a way that the unity of time would be restored and that man's origin would be no more than a date, a fold in the sequential series of beings, placing that origin and with it the appearance of culture, the dawn of civilizations, within the stream of biological evolution. It sanctioned also the inverse and complementary endeavor to align the experience man has of things, the knowledge he has acquired of them, and the sciences he has thus been able to constitute, in accordance with chronology, so that though all man's beginnings have their locus within the time of things, his individual or cultural time makes it possible, in a psychological or historical genesis, to define the moment at which things meet the face of their truth for the first time. In each of these two alignments, the origin of things and the origin of man are subordinated to each other. But the mere fact that there are two possible and irreconcilable alignments indicates the fundamental asymmetry that characterizes modern thought on origin. Moreover, this thought brings into a final light and, as it were, into an essentially reticent clarity a certain stratum of the original in which no origin was in fact present, but in which man's time, which has no beginning, made manifest for a possible memory the time of things which has no memory. This leads to a double temptation, to psychologize all knowledge of whatever kind, and to make psychology into a sort of general science of all sciences. Or inversely, to describe this original stratum in a style that avoids all positivism in such a way that as to make it possible on this basis to disturb the positivity of all science and to use the fundamental, insuperable character of this experience as a weapon against it. But in setting itself the task of restoring the domain of the original, modern thought immediately encounters the recession of the origin, and paradoxically, it proposes the solution of advancing in the direction of this ever-deepening recession. It tries to make it appear on the far side of experience as that which sustains it by its very retreat, as that which is nearest to its most visible possibility, as that which is within thought immanent. And if the recession of the origin is thus posited in its greatest clarity, is it not the origin itself that is set free and travels backwards until it reaches itself again in the dynasty of its archaism? This is why modern thought is doomed, at every level, to its great preoccupation with recurrence, to its concern with recommencement, to that strange, stationary anxiety which forces upon it the duty of repeating repetition. Thus, from Hegel to Marx and Spengler, we find the developing theme of a thought which, by the movement in which it is accomplished, totality attained, violent recovery at the extreme point of poverty, solar decline, curves over upon itself, illuminates its own plenitude, brings its circle to completion, recognizes itself in all the strange figures of its odyssey, and accepts its disappearance into that same ocean from which it sprang. In opposition to this return, which even though it is not happy, is perfect, we find the experience of Hölderlin, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, in which the return is posited only in the extreme recession of the origin, in that region where the gods have turned away, where the desert is increasing, so that What we are concerned with here is neither a completion nor a curve, but rather that ceaseless rending open, which frees the origin in exactly that degree to which it recedes. The extreme is therefore what is nearest. But whether this stratum of the original, revealed by modern thought in the very movement in which it invented man, is a promise of fulfillment and perfect plenitude, or restores the void of the origin. The void created both by its recession and by its approach. In any case, what is prescribed as thought is something like the same. Through the domain of the original, which articulates human experience, upon the time of nature and life, upon history, upon the sedimented past of cultures, modern thought makes it its task to return to man in his identity. In that plenitude, or in that nothing which he is himself, to history and time, in the repetition which they render impossible, but which they force us to conceive, and to being in that which it is. And by this means, in this infinite task of conceiving of the origin and what is nearest to it, and what is furthest from it, thought reveals that man is not contemporaneous with what makes him be, or with that upon the basis of which he is, but that he is within a power that disperses him, draws him far away from his own origin, but promises it to him in an immanence that will perhaps be forever snatched from him. Now, this power is not foreign to him. It does not reside outside him in the serenity of eternal and ceaselessly recommenced origins. For then the origin would be effectively posited. This power is that of his own being. Time, the time that he himself is, cuts him off, not only from the dawn from which he sprang, but also from that other dawn promised him as still to come. It is clear how this fundamental time, this time on the basis of which time can be given to experience, is different from that which was active in the philosophy of representation. Then time dispersed representation, since it imposed the form of a linear sequence upon it. But representation was able to reconstitute itself for itself in imagination, and thus to duplicate itself perfectly and to subjugate time. The image made it possible to reapprehend time in its entirety, to recover what had been conceded to secession, and to construct a knowledge as true as that of an eternal understanding. In the modern experience, on the contrary, the retreat of the origin is more fundamental than all experience, since it is in it that experience shines and manifests its positivity. It is because man is not contemporaneous with his being that things are presented to him with a time that is proper to them. And here we meet once again the initial theme of finitude. But this finitude, which was expressed first of all by the weight of things upon man, by the fact that he was dominated by life, history, and language, now appears at a more fundamental level. It is the insurmountable relation of man's being with time. Thus, by rediscovering finitude in its interrogation of the origin, modern thought closes the great quadrilateral it began to outline when the Western episteme broke up at the end of the 18th century. The connection of the positivities with finitude, the reduplication of the empirical and the transcendental, the perpetual relation of the cogito to the unthought, the retreat and return of the origin, define for us man's mode of being. It is in the analysis of that mode of being, and no longer in the analysis of representation, that reflection since the 19th century has sought a philosophical foundation for the possibility of knowledge. That brings me to part 7, called Discourse and Man's Being. This reading brought to you by Apple Carrot Ginger Juice. Okay, part 7, Discourse in Man's Being. It may be observed that these four theoretical segments, analysis of finitude, of empirico-transcendental repetition, of the unthought, and of origin, stand in a certain relation to the four subordinate domains which constituted the general theory of language in the classical age. A relation which is at first glance one of resemblance and symmetry. It will be remembered that the theory of the verb explained how language could overflow its own boundaries and affirm being, in a movement which, in return, assured the very being of language, since the latter could establish itself and open up its space only where there already existed, at least in a hidden form, a foundation provided by the verb to be. The analysis of finitude explains in the same way how man's being finds itself determined by positivities which are exterior to it and which link it to the density of things, but how in return it is finite being that gives any determination the possibility of appearing in its positive truth. Whereas the theory of articulation showed how the patterning of words and of the things they represent could occur without a hiatus between them. The analysis of the empirico-transcendental reduplication shows how what is given in experience and what renders experience possible correspond to one another in an endless oscillation. The quest for the primary designations of language drew out from the silent and innermost heart of words, syllables, and sounds themselves a dormant representation that formed, as it were, their forgotten soul, which it was necessary to bring back to light, to make speak and sing once more in order to attain a greater exactitude of thought, a more miraculous power of poetry. In a similar way, for modern thought, the inert density of the unthought is always inhabited in a certain manner by a cogito. In this thought, dormant within what is not thought, must be brought to life again and stretched out in the sovereignty of the I think. Lastly, there was a theory of derivation. In classical reflection on language. This showed how language, from the beginning of its history and perhaps in the instant of its origin, at the very point when it began to speak, shifted inside its own space, pivoted around on itself away from its primary representation, and deposited its words, even the very oldest of them, only when they had already been deployed in the figures of rhetoric. Corresponding to that analysis, we now find the effort to conceive of an ever-elusive origin, to advance towards that place where man's being is always maintained, in relation to man himself, a remoteness and a distance that constitute him. But this play of correspondences must not be allowed to delude us. We must not imagine that the classical analysis of discourse has continued without modification through the ages merely by applying itself to a new object. That the force of some historical weight has maintained it in its identity, despite so many adjacent mutations. In fact, the four theoretical segments that outlined the space of general grammar have not been preserved, but they were dissociated. They changed both their function and their level. They modified the entire domain of their validity when, at the end of the 18th century, the theory of representation was eclipsed. In the classical age, the function of general grammar was to show how a language could be introduced into the sequential chain of representations. A language that, while manifesting itself in the simple and absolutely tenuous line of discourse, presupposed forms of simultaneity, affirmation of existences and coexistences, patterning of things represented and formation of generalities, original and inerasable relation between words and things, displacement of words within their rhetorical space. In contrast, the analysis of man's mode of being as it was developed since the 19th century does not reside within a theory of representation. Its task, on the contrary, is to show how things in general can be given to representation, in what conditions, upon what ground, within what limits they can appear in a positivity more profound than the various modes of perception. And what is then revealed in this coexistence of man and things through the great spatial expanse opened up by representation is man's radical finitude. The dispersion that at the same time separates him from his origin and promises it to him, and the insuperable distance of time. The analytic of man is not a resumption of the analysis of discourse as constituted elsewhere and handed down by tradition. The presence or absence of a theory of representation, or more exactly, the primary character or derived position of that theory, modifies the equilibrium of the system from top to bottom. As long as representation goes without question as the general element of thought, the theory of discourse serves at the same time in one and the same movement as the foundation of all possible grammar and as a theory of knowledge. But as soon as the primacy of representation disappears, then the theory of discourse is dissociated, and one can encounter its disincarnated and metamorphosed form on two separate levels. On the empirical level, the four constituent segments are still to be found, but the function they perform has been wholly inverted, replacing the analysis of the verb's privileged position of its power to make discourse emerge from itself and become rooted in the being of representation. We find the analysis of an internal grammatical structure which is immanent in each language and constitute it as an autonomous being. In other words, upon itself. Similarly, the analysis of the articulation common to words and things has been replaced by the theory of inflections, the attempt to establish laws of mutation proper to words alone. The theory of the radical has been substituted for the analysis of the representative roots. Finally, where before there was the search for the boundless continuity of derivation, the lateral kinship of languages has been revealed. In other words, everything that had functioned within the dimension of the relation between things as they are represented, and words with their representative value, has now been drawn back into language and given the task of providing it with an internal legality. At foundation level, the four segments of the theory of discourse are still to be found. As in the classical age, they still serve in this new analytic of the human being to express the relation to things. But this time, the modification is the inverse of what it was previously. It is no longer a matter of replacing them in a space interior to language, but of freeing them from the domain of representation within which they were trapped, and of bringing them into play in that dimension of exteriority in which man appears as a finite, determined being, trapped in the density of what he does not think, and subject in his very being to the dispersion of time. From the moment when it was no longer in continuity with the theory of representation, the classical analysis of discourse found itself, as it were, split in two. On the one hand, it invested itself in an empirical knowledge of grammatical forms, and on the other, it became an analytic of finitude. But neither of these two transferences could take place without a total inversion of function. We are now in a position to understand, in all its implications, the incompatibility that reigns between the existence of classical discourse based upon the unquestioned evidence of representation and the existence of man as it presented in modern thought, and with the anthropological reflection that it sanctions. Something like an analytic of man's mode of being became possible only after the analysis of representative discourse had been dissociated, transferred, and inverted. And we can also sense how man's being, thus defined and posited, is weighed down by the contemporary reappearance of language in the enigma of its unity and its being as by a threat. Is the task ahead of us to advance towards a mode of thought unknown hitherto in our culture, that will make it possible to reflect at the same time, without discontinuity or contradiction, upon man's being and the being of language? If that is so, we must take the very greatest precautions to avoid anything that might be a naive return to the classical theory of discourse. A return all the more tempting, it must be said, because we are so ill-equipped to conceive of the shining but crude being of language. Whereas the old theory of representation is there, already constituted, offering us a place in which that being can be lodged and allowed to dissolve into pure function. But the right to conceive both of the being of language and of the being of man may be forever excluded. There may be, as it were, an inerasable hiatus at that point. Precisely that hiatus in which we exist and talk. So that it would be necessary to dismiss as fantasy any anthropology in which there was any question of the being of language, or any conception of language or signification which attempted to connect with, manifest, and free the being proper to man. It is perhaps here that the most important philosophical choice of our period has its roots. A choice that can be made only in the test of a future reflection. For nothing can tell us in advance upon which side the through road lies. The only thing we know at the moment, in all certainty, is that in Western culture, the being of man and the being of language have never, at any time, been able to coexist and to articulate themselves one upon the other. Their incompatibility has been one of the fundamental features of our thought. However, the mutation of the analysis of discourse into an analytic of finitude has one other consequence. The classical theory of the sign and the word had to show how representations, which succeeded one another in a chain so narrow and so tightly knit that distinctions did not appear, with the result that they were all, in short, alike, could be spread out to form a permanent table of stable differences and limited identities. It was a matter of genesis of difference, starting from the secretly varied monotony of the like. The analytic of finitude has an exactly inverse role in showing that man is determined. It is concerned with showing that the foundation of those determinations in man's very being, in its radical limitations, it must also show that the contents of experience are already their own conditions, that thought from the very beginning haunts the unthought that eludes them, and that it is always striving to recover. It shows how that origin of which man is never the contemporary is at the same time withdrawn and given as an immanence. In short, it is always concerned with showing how the other, the distant, is also the near and the same. Thus we have moved from a reflection upon the order of differences, with the analysis it presupposes, in that ontology of continuity and that insistence upon a full, unbroken being deployed in its perfection that presuppose a metaphysics, to a thought of the same, still to be conquered in its contradiction, which implies, apart from the ethics already mentioned, a dialectic in that form of ontology which, since it has no need of continuity and has to reflect upon being, only in its limited forms or in its distance, can and must do without metaphysics. Calling to one another and answering one another throughout modern thought and throughout its history, we find a dialectical interplay and an ontology without metaphysics. For modern thought is one that moves no longer towards the never completed formation of difference, but towards the ever to be accomplished unveiling of the same. Now, such an unveiling is not accomplished without the simultaneous appearance of the double. And that hiatus, minuscule and yet invincible, which resides in the and of retreat and return, of thought and the unthought, of the empirical and the transcendental, of what belongs to the order of positivity and what belongs to the order of foundations. Identity separated from itself by a distance which, in one sense, is interior to it, but in another constitutes it, and repetition which posits identity as a datum, but in the form of distance, are without doubt at the heart of that modern thought to which the discovery of time has so hastily been attributed. In fact, if we look a little bit more closely, we perceive that classical thought related the possibility of spatializing things in a table to that property possessed by pure representation. Succession to recall itself on the basis of itself, to fold back upon itself, and to constitute a simultaneity on the basis of a continuous time. Time became the foundation of space. In modern thought, what is revealed at the foundation of the history of things and of the historicity proper to man is the distance creating a vacuum within the same. It is the hiatus that disperses and regroups it at the two ends of itself. It is this profound spatiality that makes it possible for modern thought still to conceive of time and to know it as succession, to promise it to itself as fulfillment, origin, or return. Okay, that's the end of part 7 of chapter 9 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault.